It's early.
Whenever we cooked this up a couple months ago, we decided an interesting topic, which is obviously what we settled on, is elements of relations between brothers in the book of Genesis. The whole book of Genesis is filled with rotten relations between brothers and in families. And one way of reading the book of Genesis is the failure of families, and that's an interesting way to look at it. So tonight we're going to look at Cain and Abel. What I'm going to do in a moment is I'm going to bring up the text and I'm going to read it through. It's, if I recall, I think it's 18 verses. And those of you who studied Bible with me or studied Bible with anybody or studied Bible on your own, certainly the Hebrew Bible, knows that the greatness of the Hebrew Bible is evidenced by the fact that unpacking a 17 or 18 verse story is immense. It's an immense task. And we're going to get a little below the surface this evening, but we're not going to be able to do the whole thing because the story of Cain and Abel raises innumerable wonderful questions, interesting and challenging questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the text. I've debated whether I should keep it up or not while we're talking. And I think what I'm going to do is take it down, take the screen share down, but bring it up as either of us feels it's necessary. I'm going to read it. I'm going to ask Chris a question or two. Then I'm going to turn it over to him. And if past history is any indication of what's going to happen this evening, as one talks about with mutual funds, we'll go back and forth and back and forth. And we'll probably let ourselves go at this for under 40 minutes or so. I mean, I'm not going to hold us to that. And then we'll raise questions. And given the audience we have, I'm expecting really good questions because you're all really good at asking good questions. And we'll go a little past the hour. He's coming to us from Maine. Rabbi and his wife Betsy, retired from Baltimore and moved to Maine. A move that he seems to thoroughly enjoy, but mystifies me in terms of weather. Not that Maine's not a beautiful state, but it's now 10 o'clock there. He goes to bed typically at 9. So he's doing us all a big favor by staying up, and we don't want to keep him up too late. And he'll come back again next week, I hope, if we treat him nicely. And we'll go at this again next week. Next week, we're going to do Jacob and Esau. I will say just real quickly, because I've been thinking about the textual presentation. Cain and Abel is in one felled swoop. Jacob and Esau is in, if memory serves, three discrete portions, and I'll sew them together and probably do something like what we're doing now. Read the whole thing, and then we'll have at it with Q&A. Now, Jason's. What is Jason? I'm only looking at the chat because it's Jason.
I was offering our guest a cup of coffee virtually.
I see. I will say before we begin, I'm pleased that so many of you came this evening. I think you'll get a lot out of it, and so I'm glad that our marketing produced enough interest to bring you all here. So let me bring up the screen share. I thought I did my job right, but apparently I didn't. Give me a second. I know why. It took me a long time using Zoom to realize when you're going to screen share, you got to make darn sure that the screen share you're sharing is prominent on your screen. And I had to send an email. I had it all ready to go, and then I had to send an email which blocked the screen share. So there it is, Genesis chapter 4. Just to remind you, and I'm not going to go too deeply into this, Cain and Abel comes right after the story of Adam and Eve. So that's another relationship between Adam and Eve and God that doesn't go according to plan, although that's a whole other story, which those of you who study Torah with me know that I have my own interpretation of the Adam and Eve story. But here we go. So, and also I'm doing this from the Safaria text, which I like. But one of the things the editors did along the way is they created this vast and wonderful website, filled with unbelievable quantities of Jewish texts. Is they became conscious of and changed verbiage according to remove the male dominant language. That's where I was going with this. So the literal translation, I'm not going to do this for the whole text, but I just want to point it out. The literal translation of the text is Adam, meaning man, but they turn it into human to neutralize the language. Okay. Now I believe there's only one place, maybe two, where I'm going to stop. Otherwise, I'm just going to read the whole thing through, ask Chris a question or two, and that'll begin our conversation. Okay. So now the human knew his wife, Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gained a person with the help of Adonai. Then she bore his brother Abel. Abel became a keeper of sheep, and Cain became a tiller of the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought an offering to Adonai from the fruit of the soil. And Abel, for his part, brought the choicest of the firstlings of his flock. Adonai paid heed to Abel and his offering. But to Cain, his offering, to Cain and his offering, beg your pardon, God paid no heed. Cain was much distressed and his face fell. And Adonai said to Cain, why are you distressed? Why is your face fallen? Surely if you do right, there is uplift. But if you do not do right, sin couches at the door, its urges toward you, yet you can be its master. Cain said to his brother Abel, and you see the ellipsis there, this is the only place I'm aware of in the whole Hebrew Bible where all editions that I'm aware of acknowledge that there's something missing here. All kinds of editors, all kinds of translators will acknowledge possible textual errors and suggest emendations, but you almost always in the margins, or they will put it in brackets. But here there is clearly something missing, and we don't know what it is, it's missing. And so in the translation, we have this ellipsis. Cain said to his brother Abel, and when they were in the field, Cain set upon his brother Abel and killed him. Adonai said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? What have you done? Hark. The word hark is nowhere to be found in the Hebrew. Hark, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Therefore, you shall be more cursed than the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. If you till the soil, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. You shall become a ceaseless wanderer on earth. Cain said to Adonai, my punishment is too great to bear. Since you have banished me this day from the soil, I must avoid your presence and become a restless wanderer on earth. Anyone who meets me may kill me. Adonai said to him, I promise if anyone kills Cain, sevenfold vengeance shall be exacted. And Adonai put a mark on Cain, lest anyone who met him should kill him. Cain left the presence of Adonai and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. And I'm going to read just the next verse, even though the story really ends in the verse I just read. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch, and that he then founded a city and named the city after his son Enoch. So Chris gets the first word, and there's a lot going on here. So let me begin based on our conversation today, Chris. What's the nature of the nature of God that appears in this picture, in this story? What do we make of it, and where do we go with it? Well, we can focus on Cain, we can focus on Abel, and all kinds of other things. But let's start with God, the big picture.
Well, this story is loaded with ambiguities, and it invites wild leaps of the imagination, it seems to me. And one needs to pay attention to the silences or to the gaps, and the ambiguities that are built into the story. So, at coming to the question of God and what is the character of God revealed in this story, and is it a character that earns our respect and merits our adoration? I want to leave that as an open question at the outset, because let's start with the names themselves. When Cain comes on the scene, Eve makes a big deal about it. There's a lot of attention and hoopla about his arrival, which is embedded in his name itself. And this rings very true to my own parenting experience. The arrival of our first child evoked this sense that the wonders of the world had suddenly opened up, and perhaps our firstborn child wasn't going to be the Mashiach, but nevertheless was going to be a character that brought great light into the world. We then had twins, and if you were to look at our photo albums, you would see that every time our firstborn rolled over, there was a picture of him and there was great attention. And at the back of the photo album, there are a few pictures of our twins sort of stuck into the back. And it seems to me that there was a kind of attention received by the firstborn that may not be replicated with those that follow. At least that seems to be the case with Cain and Abel, because while there's fanfare around the arrival of Cain, Abel, the Hebrew word havel, suggests a wisp, a nothingness, a breath, or to put it in the vernacular, almost an afterthought. So right from the get-go, the parents seem to be doting and paying a great deal of attention, if you will, to their firstborn. And on the other hand, Abel seems to get the hind tit, as it were. So in any case, it's so interesting that right from the get-go, when offerings are brought, and to some degree, at least the ordering of the story suggests that the idea of offering a sacrifice was a contribution that Cain came up with, and Abel follows suit, which is to say he imitates the gesture that was first articulated and embodied by the behavior of his older brother. And then God lavishes attention, embracing and accepting Abel's sacrifice, and has no apparent regard for Cain's sacrifice. So if you look at that conduct, it would seem to me that the natural conclusion would be that God has a great deal to learn about parenting. That anyone who takes their kids to the ice cream store and gives one a great big scoop, and the other one gets neglected, they're setting up a disastrous exchange between the siblings. Attention, if it's not delivered in a way that seems equitable, normally does not generate harmony in the household, or at least that's been my experience. So I think from the very beginning, there's a question that's raised that I think continues to haunt Christians, Jews, Muslims, does God play favorites? And is there something about God's preferences that suggests that a kind of scarcity? There's just not enough love, enough attention to go around. So that seems to me to be the first conundrum posed by the story. What do you think, Phil?
Well, I want to, excuse me, I want to add to what you said about the birth order. When I've got the text open here on my phone. Let me just find it a second. So the human knew his wife, as I said, and she conceived and bore Cain, but it's the mother and not the father who comments on the name.
Yeah.
Cain is the Hebrew. Vatomer kaniti ish et Adonai, which they translate, I have gained a person with the help of Adonai.
Yeah.
And so the word kaniti means to acquire or to buy. The modern Hebrew verb liknot means to buy. So one way of translating this is Eve, who by the way, we learn her name only now, the first time her name is applied here, and Adam doesn't say anything. I have acquired a man through the eternal God. And then when Abel is born, he's not the mom doesn't interpret the name that she gives him, and as Chris pointed out, it's Hevel. Now, those of you who are studying Ecclesiastes with me on Shabbat morning will recall that in the first chapter of Ecclesiastes, whoever Ecclesiastes is says Hevel Hevelim Hakol Havel. Everything is mere breath, emptiness, existential angst. So in this case, the first son is named acquisition, being, material. And the second one is named wisp, that's Chris's word, emptiness. So that's kind of nice. Kind of interesting. So it's not just really the God's parenting, which is a very interesting question. And of course, the question, does God play favorites in the broader sense among the religions? And I think that's worth talking about. Also, there's a real favoritism here, but the favoritism kind of meets its doom because the favorite child kills the wisp. Cain kills Abel. I got that right. Yeah, Cain kills Abel.
Well, so I think that you're making a really interesting point because it seems to me that maybe what you're suggesting is that if Eve is showing favoritism directed to Cain, then God's favoring of Abel's sacrifice reverses the priorities,
right,
and if you will, reinstates Abel as a figure to be taken seriously.
Yeah, that's a good point. And also I will say it's a characteristic of the book of Genesis, this notion of primogeniture, that big fancy word that you now can use in crossword puzzles, is reversed almost entirely in the book of Genesis. You know, Joseph becomes the favored child, and we'll talk about Jacob and Esau next week. Now, Esau is older than Jacob by about 10 seconds, but nevertheless, he deserves the favor, and it gets stolen from him. So here too, it gets reversed.
Yeah.
About the sacrifice, this is as Chris pointed out, there's a lot of silence or ambiguity, which is a characteristic, I think, of a lot of great literature and a lot of great biblical literature in particular. There's no request on the part of God to bring a sacrifice. And as Chris pointed out, it does seem it's by Cain's initiative. And so, you know, there's a Rashi, which I think is interesting. Rashi, the commentator, you know, when you talk about his commentaries, you say there's a Rashi, and there's a famous Rashi to the issue of the offerings that the brothers bring, and it's in it's in the force of one or two words. Cain brought an offering to Yahweh out of God from the fruit of the soil. We know he's a farmer. And Abel, for his part, brought the choicest of the firstlings. He didn't just so Rashi says, Cain went into he went into the orchard. He picked a wormy apple and a rotten orange and some celery that was drooping and put it in a basket. And meanwhile, the brother picked the choicest and the firstlings, the first child of its mother, and brings it. And so God looks down and says, "Yeah, this wormy stuff, I'm not going to accept that. But these wonderful young animals show that Abel cared much more. He's much more careful about bringing stuff to me." Now that raises the question, of course, or in my mind, why does God care about the quality of the sacrifice? And we may go back and forth about that a little bit. And in the end, I don't think the Rashi. I'm one of those unfortunate types that I don't love Rashi. I don't know. I've never fallen in love with Rashi, but nevertheless, his commentary is always interesting and at least worth bringing up. So there is.
Well,
there is. Go ahead.
So Phil, as you know, both within the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition, this story makes commentators very uncomfortable. And one of the ways of resolving the discomfort is
why don't you articulate the discomfort a little bit?
Well, the discomfort is that it suggests that God, in playing favorites, is betraying fundamental principles of justice.
Uh-huh.
He's betraying a commitment to equity. So the way to resolve that issue that is taken up by subsequent, again, this is really early in the Christian tradition, or it's early in the Jewish tradition as well. It's to elevate the nobility of Abel by suggesting he brings forth the best and he has the best intention, he has noble purpose in mind. And conversely, Cain is demonized. And there's a certain midrash that I can't put my finger on at the moment, but I can dredge it up, that suggests that actually, you had mentioned how Adam isn't in the picture just yet. The notion of demonizing Cain to such an extent that it seemed that Eve had relations with the serpent, and indeed he is a demonic figure. So there is a strong tendency for subsequent commentators to generate these caricatures of these two figures that puts them at diametrically opposite ends of the moral spectrum.
Uh-huh.
So,
yeah. And of course, I can't. Are you suggesting that's in the midrashic literature? Because I'm not.
Yeah, there's midrashic material that gets at that.
Because that gets back to the Adam and Eve story, which is not on the table this evening. Because for the most part, the serpent is not seen as demonic in any event in the Jewish tradition, however evil the serpent may be. But so I want to say something, and those of you who have studied with me will hear a similar invitation that I've given in other instances. I pointed out the ellipsis in the translation that it indicates the gap in the text, and suddenly they're in Cain's field, and Cain kills him. So the question is, what's in the gap? What's in that 18-minute tape that gets erased? I think there's an interesting midrash. There's no answer. There's no right answer to that question, but I think there's an interesting midrash to be written to inquire as to what brought the brothers into the field, and what did they say? What might they have said to each other, and that might have compelled the one brother to murder the other brother. Keeping in mind, as Chris and I, Sandy rather, hold on for just a second. Oh, now I lost my train of thought. Sorry, let me dial back here. I lost it. It'll come back.
Yeah, but I think you're raising an interesting question. If you were to fill in the blank, if you were to fill in that gap, what do you imagine the conversation was that when Cain and Abel went into the field, or what Cain might have said to have lured Abel into the field?
Yeah.
And just prior to that, however, there is this challenge in a sense that God puts to Cain, knowing how pissed off he is, that he has not been the recipient of the attention that he feels he had coming to him. And he is, in a sense, reprimanded by God, who tells him, get a grip. You need to master yourself. You have the ability to control yourself. Get about the business of gaining some self-control. And I don't know how it is for you, but when somebody tells me, get a grip, rather than induce some sense of humility or a sense of motivation to gain greater self-mastery, it actually inflames my sense of self, and getting defensive, I just lash out more.
And
so it raises this question of how well does God comprehend the human condition if he is giving instructions that exceed the capability in all that emotional turmoil that is quite simply beyond Cain's ability.
See, there isn't, Sandy, I didn't forget you. I'll get to you in a second. So unlike me, don't forget what you want to say. I think there are two ways of looking at that reprimand from God. I'll read it again to remind you. Why has your face fallen? Why are you distressed? If you do right, there is uplift. If you do not do right, sin couches at the door. It urges toward you, and yet you can be its master. Now, I have to say, I think in the end, this is representative of bad parenting. It's a bad parent, but it's a bad parent trying to be a good parent. He's saying, look, all right, you didn't do right this, you didn't do right this time. I mean, really, look at what he brought and look at what you brought. I mean, you're a schlump, you're a schmagegi, but you can improve. And there's the next time you guys bring sacrifices, and you can make a nice fruit salad and throw in a nice bit of avocado or some rare fruit. But at the same time, I think the impact of it, I have to agree with Chris that at that moment when God has just said, I'm not accepting what you brought to me, but I'll use Chris's language, get a grip. That's not exactly what God says, but get a grip and do better next time. But Cain goes home and he sulks and gets on the email and invites, or the text, and invites the brother to meet him in the field. I still think that the gap in that story is ripe for interpretation. But Sandy, what's on your mind? Don't forget to unmute.
I wanted to ask you what you thought they said in the field. What do you where that gap is? What, if you were rewriting this, what would you put in there?
Well, I have my own, I wrote a midrash, which I'm afraid I lost. I don't know where it is, a long time ago, where the gap involves simply an invitation, but they get out into the field, and we don't know anything about these characters. We know the most about the mother, and we know about Cain because he's angry and kills his brother, but we don't know anything really that leads up to, well, we know that he's unhappy at his failure, but there's not a lot here. And in my mind, actually, Abel Abel out in the field gets haughty and says, yeah, God accepted me and not you, which kind of fits into the dynamic that Chris developed, which I didn't see when I considered this story back when I wrote the Midrash. So that's my idea, and that at the haughtiness, reacting to the haughtiness of his brother, Cain hits him so hard he kills him. And which reminded me when Chris and I were talking earlier today about the case of Moses and the Egyptian taskmaster, when Moses leaves the palace as a young man, and he's so angry at the taskmaster beating the slave that he hits him. This is my reading anyway, unexpectedly so hard that he kills him. That's I think what goes on here, and which brings me back to what I forgot to say earlier, namely that this is the first bit of homicide in the Bible. Now we're only in chapter 4, and there's a lot of homicide to come, no doubt. But this is the first homicide in the Bible, and it occurs in the absence of any law. The only law that the Bible has given thus far is, Peru Uruvu, be fruitful and multiply, which Adam and Eve faithfully obey at the beginning of the story. So there's no real guidance yet about this matter. Now, it's possible you could argue that reason alone teaches that murder is not a good thing, and I'm going to let Chris respond in a second, because I certainly don't want to monopolize the conversation. But in the absence of law, it strikes me that Cain is not executed, but is in fact only wanders because he's told he can't be a farmer anymore, so he's got to wander for the rest of his life. But Rab, let me throw the back in your court. I'm sorry for talking so long.
No, it's fine. I imagine them going out in the field and maybe having a bit of a surprising exchange. And I can easily imagine Abel having a chip on his shoulder now, having a pretty inflated sense of himself.
Yeah.
And in the process, that just ticks Cain off all the more. And finally, Cain, having just been told to control himself, in the face of the taunting that may have come from his younger brother, lashes out. I've seen that pattern played out in my household with some regularity, at least when my kids were younger. So I think that the story is poignant precisely because it feels so familiar, that it's so easy to lose control when there's a sense that one child is being elevated over and above the other. The scramble for attention can yield some really wild behavior.
And note the attention is to God. Adam and Eve are not in the picture.
Yeah.
It's God. God, in a sense, is literally the parent. Now, Rachel, Christine, I didn't see whose hand went up first, so I'm going to just. We got 3 hands. Okay, so I'm just going by what's on my screen. Christine, Rachel, and Wendy. Christine, Rachel, and Wendy. I'm not picking favorites. I don't want you to get into an argument about it. It's just how it's
I wasn't the firstborn anyway, and it's the wrong gender. But the I have a couple of things that I'm sort of mulling over, and I have been for some time about this story. One is, yes, the Old Testament, the Genesis God is a bit ham-handed, and he's kind of learning how to be a God, and he's not real good at it at the beginning. And he's certainly not very good parent, but in a way, I think his accepting Abel's sacrifice is saying, look, he did it the right way. Burnt offerings, what do you want? Are you going to give me a little campfire? This is like ridiculous. I want meat, but this is a weenie roast. It's not just sort of, put the briquettes on the, on the Weber. But so part of it is also that he may be trying to tilt the scale, since Cain is obviously favored, right, in his name and and he's clearly the favorite kid, right, in the everyday world. And I think he has a big head, and I think that the one way of seeing it is God trying to like say, all right, you're getting a little spoiled here. Let me elevate your brother so that you're more on an even keel, which again it's terrible parenting technique, by the way, but nevertheless it may be well intentioned. I don't want to give him a mean spirit in this one. He has to save that for Job. But the other thing is, and this I have to wear my little anthropology hat, there's a metaphorical thing going on here about farming versus pastoralism.
Oh, yeah.
And in order to have, if you will, civilization, if you in that narrow sense, you need cities. Okay, how do you get cities? You have to have agriculture. Oh, in most cases, okay, that's not universally true, by the way, but it is in most cases. And it marginalizes the pastoralists, smaller herds, and you can't really have them everywhere. They have to be confined. And so there is a symbolic killing of pastoralism with the rise of agriculture. So, so metaphorically, and it's followed through because Cain founds a city with his kid, his lineage is a citified lineage. Whereas we don't know what happens to, Abel ends up still being a pastoralist and wandering around for quite a while. I mean, Abel's dead, but, the people that he comes from. So those were the two things, little things that I thought I would ask about.
Good. But Rachel, what's on your mind?
Well, one thing Christine already kind of brought up, I was going to ask Chris if you were implying that God is kind of learning people and still doesn't get it too much about his creature's psychology. I didn't know if that's what you were kind of saying earlier, Chris.
Well, that is a first impression that I draw out of the story, but you'll see at the end, I actually want to suggest that there was something else deeper going on that is far more suggestive that God may deserve more credit than I gave him at the very beginning.
So stay tuned, huh?
Yes, stay tuned.
And then I was going to ask Rabbi Cohen, you mentioned that there was an absence of law other than be fruitful and multiply, but still God says something about not sinning. And for me, I thought sin and law, to me, how is there sin but not law? Do you know what I mean?
No, it's actually a great question, and the best answer I can give you off the top of my head is that ambiguity. And in that case, if Chris may have a better answer. But I guess the text has to assume the existence of sin.
Yeah.
Because that's what's going on. In that sense, the author is kind of getting chronologically ahead of himself.
Well, I would again, I've been very influenced by Jewish interpretations of the first Genesis story, so I have to revert to that. It seems to me that when Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden, it's not first and foremost that they ate of the fruit, the forbidden fruit. The failure that led to their expulsion was their refusal to take responsibility for what they had done. That was the sin. The sin was as soon as the question is posed to Adam, he tries to transfer the blame or the responsibility to Eve, And when Eve is interrogated and asked, "What did you done?" she tries to put it all on the serpent.
Yeah, but
So, in a fundamental way, I think that the violation that leads to their expulsion has everything to do with this inability to own up and take responsibility for what had been done.
I have to pose a friendly amendment, which I always do when the garden story comes up, which is if you read to the end of the chapter, God says to somebody near some being, now that they've acquired knowledge of good and evil, God forbid they should eat from the tree of life. We got to kick them out because they're going to become immortal, and God knows what it would be like to have these immortal people running around. So the expulsion is primed, as Chris put it, by that whole series of things, and it's and by the way, it's a very funny little scene. We read the Bible and we think it's such a somber document, but when God confronts the man and the woman, the man says, "Oh, I didn't do it. The woman made me do it," and the woman says, "Well, the snake made me do it," and they're all looking at the damn snake, the poor snake, who then also gets punished. It's a pretty funny scene, but it's primed. But the final causation is because God doesn't want these poor schlubs to become immortal.
Yeah.
So Wendy, floor over to you. And
Thank you, guys.
there are at least three more points because Chris is hinting at something, and I've got two others in mind. One of which I'm going to ask Chris to talk about also. So Wendy, what's on your mind?
All right, well, a couple of things. One thing, when we look at God favoring Abel's offering versus Cain's, it could also be a message from the author to the reader. Hey, if you're going to bring a sacrifice to God, it should be your best. So you can look at it in that way as the author talking to the reader.
Yeah, and Rashi, I think, would very much want to applaud that move.
No, a piece of that got me thinking only through the course of this last hour is that as we were interpreting Cain's, Abel's name, Hevel, nothingness, mere nothingness. Why did he bring the best? And one possible reason is because he loved the Lord as God and he wanted to please the Lord as God. But another part of it is he's lived his whole life as nothing, and he's been the favorite, and his brother's been the favorite. And this is a way for him to achieve a level of acceptance, or hoping to achieve a level. And he's not necessarily assuming that his sacrifice would be preferred over his brothers, but at least let it be the equal of my brothers. Because who am I? I am but nothing, and let me be something. And Lord knows he becomes something, but leads to his own death, I'm afraid. Wendy, was there more you wanted to say?
Yeah, there was one other thing, because Chris mentioned that God favoring one over the other is really not fair. And, what's up with that? And so one can look at the behavior of Cain, and Cain doesn't say to God, "You're being unfair. I want you to be just." And so perhaps that's why we don't think of Adam and Eve or Cain and Abel as the first, Jews, but Abraham is, because he's the one who demands that God has to be just. But Cain and Abel don't, and neither do Adam and Eve.
Good. So Chris, I'm sure you've got other things on your mind, and please hold forth on them. But I'm going to ask you to do that interpretation of the word damim, because it's really good, and you brought it up in our conversation today.
Well, the ambiguity surrounding once Cain has killed his brother, and he's confronted by God, and that archetypal question is posed about, am I my brother's keeper? He again seems to be deflecting responsibility, a talent that he might have learned from his parents. But then the enormity of what has taken place by his killing his brother begins to dawn. And when there's that notion that the translation is that his blood cries out from the ground, but actually the Hebrew, it's in the plural, it's his bloods. And again, this is an interpretation that one can find in Islam, as well as within Judaism, that the plural is enormously important, because what it suggests is what was killed was just not simply an individual, not just Abel, but what was killed was the potential for a whole civilization. It's bloods, damim. The killing of a person is a killing of a potential that could replenish the entire earth. And therefore, the enormity of the magnitude of what has been done hits home to Cain, I think, perhaps for the first time.
Yeah, and I want to get back to the line. There have been times when we read this story, although our conversation belies what I'm about to say, that sometimes I think the whole story was constructed around that one line, Hashomer Achi Anochi, am I my brother's keeper? Because of course it's an ironic statement. Cain is saying, "What do I know? What do I know? It's not my job to take care of my brother." But what's the ironic answer to the question? Of course, it's my job to take care of my brother. Somebody once asked me to give her a reference for a very important fellowship, and she had to write a Jewish essay for this. It was a Jewish organization that she was applying to, and she wrote the whole essay focusing on, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And of course, so out of this, we're saying, I think correctly, that there's no conversation, there's no dialogical here demand for justice, but in the end, the whole story is about all these things that we're talking about that are really, really interesting, but ultimately about justice. Hashomer Achi Anochi, am I my brother's guard? Am I my brother's caretaker? And the answer is damn well you're your brother's, your sister's caretaker.
Yeah.
That's a great piece to the story.
Yeah, and Phil, again, building on that, the saying, he who saves a single life, it's as though he saved the entire world. Right. And he or she who kills somebody, it's as though they destroyed an entire world. Right. The precious generative possibilities, even within a single individual, are absolutely mind-blowing, which is why the killing of anyone is of such great moment.
Yeah. Jason, what's on your mind?
Well, I would just like to follow up Chris's comment there and ask, do we have any reason to believe that they understood the magnitude of killing? There was previously no human that had died. They might not have really had any, I tend to think of things somewhat more practically than is actually necessary in these circumstances. But, there were 4 people at this point, and none of them had died. They didn't know of it as a concept. So I wonder if maybe this is our way of becoming aware as people from the beginning that the first death coming this way shows us how important it was based on God's reaction. I'm just kind of, is that,
that sounds good to me, that there's a discovery that gets made at this moment about the sanctity and the enormity of human life. And this was an unknown until this encounter with death.
Yeah, I think you were, Jason, I think you were unnecessarily self-deprecatory there. It's a really good point. One doesn't know how much the author really thinks about these things, but when you write, and you write great literature, things come out that maybe you don't intend, you don't have in your frontal lobe, but is there somewhere. And here you're right. This is the first death, and the first death is also a killing, and it's entirely it's at least imaginable that as Cain reached out to smack his brother, it was inconceivable that he would not wake up. It was just a bit of anger. Christine, and then I think Rav, you hinted at a sort of a Big Bang moment, which I'll turn over to you.
Yeah,
And
I'll
then,
make it really quick.
and then we'll open it up for any more questions that you might
Okay.
have.
Well,
Go
this
ahead.
is really quick. If you were customarily, I mean, if you're dealing with custom versus law, nobody was there that witnessed this killing, and that in groups that don't have states, right, that matters, the absence of a witness.
Yeah.
And therefore, I mean, if I were a lawyer back in those days, which of course I wouldn't be because there was no law, but that would be manslaughter, right? Maybe he fell when they socked him and he fell and he hit his head on a rock. We don't know this, right?
Yeah.
And that would
Yeah.
cause a lot of blood, right? But in any case, we don't know. And it's that ambiguity, I think, that means that that God sends him into exile. It doesn't kill him in retribution. He sends him into exile.
And I have to pose a friendly amendment to that. God does not send him into exile. God said he goes. God says you can't farm anymore. And Cain says, well, if I can't farm, I got to wander. So whatever, Chris, whatever your big moment is, why don't you also comment, if you would, about the mark, the mark of Cain?
Yeah, well, let me move towards. I'm not sure how you're going to find this to be a revelatory contribution, but what strikes me as a really delicious ambiguity in the story has to do with the character of Cain, because when he says and acknowledges the magnitude of the crime that has been committed. One way of translating the text would say, he's just been given a sentence. He's been told he's going to be a wanderer. And as soon as the sentence has been delivered, he says either the punishment is greater than I can bear, in which case the characterization of Cain is that he's sniveling and trying to weasel his way out of the punishment that he's just been delivered. So again, his character is disclosed as somebody who's trying to avoid responsibility or get out from under God's judgment. That's one way of seeing the word avon. The other move that one can make is to say, instead of saying my punishment is too great, it's my iniquity. The crime that I have committed and the weight of that is so heavy on me. I don't think I can bear up. It's more, and therefore he emerges from that translation or from that move as the first penitent, the first person who's beginning to really take some responsibility for what he's done. So the text, if you will, leaves us with some uncertainty about Cain's true character, and I find that to be to invite some very serious exploration and deeper thinking. But moving on to I guess our time is getting away from us. Moving on to the larger point that I wanted to come back to, which is maybe God isn't such a bad parent after all. Perhaps the story, rather than being a story that sets in motion a paradigm or a pattern of sibling rivalries that end up constantly leading one to be elevated and the other degraded and demeaned. And instead, maybe the thrust of the story is to try to convey to Cain and to the reader, to the community, that they need to learn exactly what Cain failed to learn, which is that there are some gifts that are given to our neighbors and to others in this world that simply don't belong to us. I'm never going to be a musician. I'm never going to have a number of the talents that people I know and admire have. And the only way I can really enjoy those God-given gifts is by sitting at their feet and learning and enjoying and trying to build a world of mutual blessing. So the challenge that Cain is confronted with is a challenge that all of us are confronted with. We're not going to get as much attention as we may feel we need or deserve, but that might be a blessing because it redirects us to attend to the gifts that have been delivered to others around us. And the reason Phil and I think, seized on this is that this text has been read by both Jews and Christians as a typological text, which is to say, Cain and Abel are seen as representing Jews and Christians, or you can divide up the groups in any way you want. But the point is that it's seen as a way in which there is a zero-sum logic at work, and that people think that if they win, it must require somebody else to lose. And it's precisely the breaking of that pattern that the story of Cain and Abel is prompting us to consider. How do we overcome that impulse to try to take over the entire playing field as though we own it all and deserve it all?
Yeah, so that in that sense, the story is the lesson is a particularly modern one. The idea, and this is something I learned from Chris a long time ago. One of the many things I've learned from him, namely that in looking at let's just restrict it to two traditions, and in a way it's kind of being trivial because we just got a moment, but over the years I can't tell you how many people have told me, well, Judaism and Christianity are the same thing. They both want you to be a good person. And of course, both traditions do want you to be a good person, but there's a lot more to each tradition that nuances that and so much else, that it really does a disservice to the idea of interfaith dialogue to presume that you're going to walk away from that dialogue just shaking hands, hugging, and singing Kumbaya, and just saying, oh, we're ultimately the same. I mean, in some way, we are ultimately the same. We are all created in the divine image, but the traditions to which we give our loyalty teaches us things differently. And why not understand those differences, and where we disagree in serious ways? All right, we agree to disagree, but what we can learn from each other is also the great gift of talking to two traditions, talking to one another. And and before I learned this from Chris, and I remember when I learned it, it goes back to my time in Philadelphia, I was one of those people willing to say, Jews and Christians, like I said, our traditions are basically the same. Well, they're not basically the same. There are big differences between them. And let's appreciate those differences, like Cain, and getting back to Cain and Abel, using that, among other things, using that story to talk about separate individual human identities and the separate collective human identities of different groups, in this case, religious traditions. I'll give you the last word, and then we'll open it, Chris, and we'll open up for any questions you might have.
Yeah. Well, I really bristle at that notion that, we're all the same, or what really counts is what we have in common. Because then the interplay between Christians and Jews becomes just a narcissistic exercise. We look in the mirror and we think we're seeing somebody different, but it's just our own image reflected back at us. And the beauty from my Christian perspective of Judaism is precisely the distinctive habits and practices, story and song that doesn't belong to me, never will, but that has expanded and enlarged my sense of possibility and the wonder that the world can hold so much that is beyond and always will be beyond my own grasp. So again, it just strikes me that this story is evocative of holding out a promise that has yet to be realized, that there is a way for siblings, for family to relate to one another, recognizing that there is perhaps a great deal of genetic material that we hold in common. But nevertheless, it is the distinctive blessings that belong to each of us that can, if we have the will and the heart and the head, that can really expand and challenge us to break out of our insularity. And God knows, I just think that one of the things that's so dreadfully concerning is just how suffocating it can be not to open ourselves to people who see the world differently than we do.
All right. So questions, other questions, please feel free.
Well, I'll chime in with a couple things I'm thinking about. One is,
Go right ahead.
I just recently watched again the film Amadeus, which I know is going to seem like a major diversion here, but
No, it's not.
I just
Not at
started
all.
thinking of that story as an allegory, and because you have these two very similarly situated musicians, and one perceives the other as favored by God, and he loses his faith, and he sets out to kill him. And I thought, I never thought of it before we're having this conversation, that that's sort of what that movie is telling us in a different way. And sorry if it's a spoiler, but it came out in the 80s, so if you didn't see it yet. But
No, I think
and I wonder, is that
that-
something you
that's
seem
good.
you seem to have thought of this already?
No, I think that's spot on. I think that and again, it really, that's a film that really disclosed how jealousy can absolutely overwhelm and obsess. It can, or more accurately, it can possess our spirit.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's all told as a confession too, which is, so I'm sure there's that element that's valued in terms of that whole. Really, I mean, that's what made me think of it in a religious context, but it wasn't until we're having this conversation that it occurred to me of the parallels with this story.
Yeah.
Good.
There's probably a lot of other ones. I mean, I'm sure.
It's worth going back to Steinbeck's East of Eden, which again is another rendering of the story.
And now I have to read. I've never read that.
Yeah, listen. I listened to it on tape, but it was great.
It's wonderful.
Any other questions? Rachel, is that your hand? Your hand up for a second time, right? Go ahead.
Yes. Well, I just didn't know if you guys didn't get to talking about the mark of Cain. I don't know if there's time.
Yeah, again, I the only thing I would say about the mark of Cain is it's not clear whether the mark signals a stigma that he carries, if you will, a certain kind of curse for what he has done, and that therefore the mark will set him apart as a murderer, or if the mark is actually a kind of blessing that protects him, because God makes it very clear that if anyone attacks Cain, he will be protected. So does it actually suggest that there is a kind of ongoing care that God is lavishing on Cain, even in the aftermath of this tragedy?
I have to vote for the second choice, and I can defend that by saying we don't know what the mark is. I mean, we don't know what the mark what it is at all. But he gets to build a city, And so in that accomplishment in his life, building a city, it would seem that the mark is a gift and not a curse. That what God gives him protects him and enables him to build the city with whatever the final accomplishments of that act might be. Jason?
Well, I know we talked a little bit about God as parent, and but I'm kind of curious too. I know I'm drifting into pop culture here, but I would like to quote the midrashist Bruce Springsteen, who wrote a song called "Adam Praised a Cain," and I always hear those song lyrics in my head whenever we start talking about this story. It's all about Adam's role, and he's got a verse in there that I think is actually quite a commentary. He says, I looked it up while we were discussing it. In the Bible, brother Cain slew Abel, and east of Eden, mama, he was cast. You're born into this life paying for the sins of somebody else's past. And I think there's something really interesting there about the sins of the parents visited on the child here. Does the fact that we identify Adam and Eve as having, committed sin, does that pass to the children and taint them? Just thought I'd see if you had any thoughts about Adam's role, and because we're not really giving him any agency as a parent here for having raised the child who did these things, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Adam's complete absence here, other than being the progenitor of the two boys, leaves that question wide open. And getting back to the midrashic possibilities of writing your own commentary on this, I think that's a pretty good idea. I mean, Chris may have something to say to this. I just think with Adam's absence, I don't see what we could really say about it. But that's as I said, I've said now for the third time, that's one of the points of great literature. It leaves you, the reader, to deal with the elements. So Chris, if you have a response, and then Wendy, and I think after Wendy, we'll call it a night. I promise Chris we'll be done about now. Remember, it's 3 hours later for him.
Yeah. I can remember studying this text with some 11th and 12th graders, and there was a girl that said, it makes sense to me that Cain went on and his family, his progenitors, build a city. And I said, why? And it's as though she just read Freud. She said, because in building a city, he was building a kind of civilization that could hold in check his emotional outbursts, that the city would place certain constraints on him that would rein in what otherwise would be uncontrollable conduct. Now, those of you who live in cities, I don't right now, may feel as though actually cities are not ideal for curbing or correcting or holding in check those impulses. But I do think that there is a tradition, again, one that Freud articulates quite eloquently, about civilization, in essence, being constructed as a way of establishing restraint.
Among other things. That's great. All right. Okay, Swamp Witch, I think you get the last word here. Don't forget to unmute.
Yeah, right. I just realized that. Well, one thing I want to say in Cain's favor is, in Ezekiel, God says, it's not the death of sinners that I seek, but they should turn from their ways and live. And Cain does that. He doesn't kill again. Yeah. He lives and lives a productive life. And, changing your ways is not an easy thing. So I think Cain does deserve some props for that.
Yeah. Good. I think that's a really good ending. So thank you all. As we were talking, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this collection of what I think are 3 texts. I'll double check, but I think there are 3 places where Jacob and Esau interact in in the book of Genesis. I'll put it together and I'll send it out to the whole congregation by at least by next Wednesday. It's not going to be very long. So you'll have the opportunity to look at it in advance, though I think we'll begin again like we did tonight. I'll read that anthology and we'll begin our discussion. I hope you come back next week. You really ought to, because I thought this was really quite good. And it'll be at least as good next week. So tell all your friends and neighbors to join us, and I'll see you. And don't forget Sunday rather, we have this little Yom Ha'atzmaut thing happening, and tomorrow night is always Shabbat. So maybe I'll see you there as well. Chris, any last words?
Well, it's just wonderful to be with you all, and you were really worth staying up for. So thank you for your many contributions and for taking all of this excitement in.
Okay,
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. We'll see you next week.
Thank you all so much.
Bye.
Good night.